Prevention-based tools leave you blind to threats inside your network. By adding network traffic analysis to your SOC, you can find and stop attackers before they make their move. ExtraHop provides complete visibility at enterprise scale. Detect threats 95% faster with machine learning that helps Tier 1 analysts perform like seasoned threat hunters. Visit extrahop.com/Security Weekly to learn why the SANS Institute calls ExtraHop fast and amazingly thorough. That's extrahop.com/Security Weekly. Networks are becoming increasingly complex and fragmented, and digital transformation and DevOps are driving an explosion in network connectivity changes. With each new network connection, cyber attackers may gain another opening to breach or traverse the network. At Tufin, they've pioneered a policy-based approach to network security management using automation and analytics. As a result, you can make network changes in minutes instead of days, reliably and securely. To learn more about Tufin, the security policy company, go to securityweekly.com/Tufin and sign up for a free evaluation. By the end of 2020, 99% of exploited vulnerabilities will be publicly disclosed and known to IT system admins. The consequences of that fact means the burglar will already be in your house because you left the front door wide open. By failing to patch known vulnerabilities, how can you keep the threat actors out? Through cloud-based automation, Automox enables you to slam the door on unpatched OS and third-party vulnerabilities across your entire Windows, Mac, and Linux infrastructure. Take advantage of a free trial with Automox to not only see the vulnerability status of your infrastructure, but do something about it within minutes. Start automating the fundamentals of cyber hygiene at securityweekly.com/Automox. That's securityweekly.com/Automox. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. We're returning to Las Vegas for Black Hat and DEF CON. If you'd like to request a briefing or a sponsored interview or a sponsored appearance on this show or Paul Security Weekly, which we'll be recording live at Black Hat, you can go to securityweekly.com/booking. This week, there's less slots available than last week. I don't know what the exact count is, but it is less than last week. 4 slots left so far. So, yeah, get on that if you'd like to come hang out with us and tell the world about what your company does and why you do it better than everyone else. securityweekly.com/booking. In this segment, we are going to talk about defending against major Microsoft vulnerabilities. I thought this was timely given the remote desktop services. We did a segment last week on scanning for it, specifically about the scanning tool that you could use to scan for this particular vulnerability. And of course, you think about the SMB vulnerability, with WannaCry, NotPetya. These are like major events. I think I don't know how frequently occurring they are or if it really matters, right? And Jeff, I wanted to get your take on what you thought was a major event. I tend to think of it as something remotely exploitable, similar to the SMB vulnerability and the remote desktop vulnerability, but wanted to get your take on that.
I have so many thoughts on it. I guess my initial thought when I first read the show notes was major being something that's out of band from the regular monthly patch release that Microsoft does.
It's a good characteristic.
That was my initial thought. But then as I thought a little bit more about it, and also hopefully in terms of scoping the discussion, I think most people, when they think in terms of Microsoft, they're thinking in terms of desktops, the back office, not necessarily production systems, as it were, in many, but not all organizations. And of course, that immediately made me think of the PCI world, where many merchants are, their endpoints are not desktops or laptops or tablets. They're actually point of sale systems.
Right.
So in that sense, a whole different type of major Microsoft vulnerability might be one that's probably more close to what you're talking about is remotely exploitable, but more generically, a vulnerability that directly impacts a system that let's say is being used to transport or process critical data that you care about. In the PCI world, it would be transaction data. And so it might be one of the vulnerabilities that are rolled out as part of the monthly patch release, but because of what it does, and what systems are ultimately vulnerable, and where those systems are within your organization and your data flow, and in particular in this case it would be in your production systems. you know we might want to also include that in this discussion of major vulnerabilities.
Sure. Yeah, I also think that some of my definition includes the, I don't know, the scope of it all, the number of eyeballs on the problem, right? Like it's been covered not just in mainstream news, but right, it's been talked about in the security community, security industry as a whole. There's a
Right.
lot of awareness collectively, around this vulnerability. There's a lot of people that potentially have exploits and likely do have an exploit for this vulnerability because it exists on just so many systems, right? I think the number of systems that the vulnerability exists on certainly comes into play. The other factor for me was, I think a lot of organizations that say, well, either with the SMB vulnerability or the RDS, we don't have that technology in our environment. And what I want to raise awareness about is you may not today, or maybe you do today and you just didn't find it. But if you don't today, even if you're 100% Linux or Mac, right? What's to say someone's not going to spin up a VM or build a system or deploy a system into the cloud that contains this vulnerability, right? And
Mhm.
these vulnerabilities are so high profile that I think you have to be aware of them and be able to defend against them, even if you're like, yeah, there's no Windows 7 or Windows 8 in our environment, but there could be, right? At some point, maybe not today, but tomorrow, anyone can spin up a VM or a cloud system and put Windows on it. So that was one of the differences for me, Jeff.
Well, and what was the name of the recent one a couple weeks ago? The RDP one. Did
Mm.
it get a
Oh
logo? I
yeah,
don't.
Blue Keep is the code
Blue
name.
Keep.
Yes.
So that one, which prompted Microsoft to proactively, even though you may not have paid for it or
Yep.
paid the extended support services, they put out a patch for Windows XP.
Yep.
And certainly many of us in the security community were kind of laughing. Well, if you're still using XP, you've got all sort of different set of problems. But the reality is, there's a lot of endpoints out there, especially in the PCI world, point of sale systems, and I'm sure there's other applications of it. But there, frankly, there's a lot of XP that's still out there that's being used for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
uh, legally or illegally in terms of continued support. But uh, and hopefully this is an extremely rare
Mm-hmm.
one-off, except for it's happened now, once each in the last 2-3 years.
Yep.
If you roll up, wanna cry and not pet you. Um, the One of the tricks I think here in terms of on the topic of discovery is, we both used to work for a vulnerability scanning firm, and to me it was always problematic because the plugins that are used in the tools that our former employer produced would typically stop at discovering Windows XP and just say unsupported software,
Mm-hmm.
bad, you should change it. They don't necessarily, and I don't know if the exception's been made. I don't know if but for this most recent vulnerability, Bluekeep, have there been plugins and have the scanning engines for all the different major scan companies been able to come up with a search for the specific vulnerability in the older operating
Mm-hmm.
systems that may not be supported? Because you could conceivably, and there's many companies that do this, rely on the results of their vulnerability scan engines to tell them what to do, where things are, what things are in terms of discovery, and do we need to do something about it? So I think it very easily could be missed if all they're doing is identifying Windows XP and moving along without looking for this very specific vulnerability that has a very specific mitigation or patch that needs to be installed.
Yeah, completely agree, Jeff. And discovery was the first kind of point that I wanted to bring up in terms of being able to defend your environment. Is you have to know if you have this condition or vulnerability in this case in your environment, but your environment changes more so than ever
Yep.
before. Your
Yep.
environment is constantly changing. So, I think when we first started for Tenable, much of the mindset was still around, yeah, like I ran a scan, like we're good.
Right.
That
Right.
slowly over time, actually quickly over time, That's just not good enough. You have to have a constant handle on what's in your environment. And I guess I'm making the case for, especially in these major vulnerabilities that have a lot of exposure and are easily exploitable, you got to just constantly be looking for that condition because it could crop up, right? Once a month, it's not scanning for the vulnerability isn't good. That's a month an attacker could be in your environment.
Sure, and I think to build on that a little bit, and this is the curmudgeon in me coming out maybe a little bit, or maybe I'm being a little bit too optimistically naive, but I think organizations, enterprises should have at least some idea of what's in their network
Hmm.
by other means, like inventory control and change
Yep.
management control, without simply relying on scan technologies to have them be doing the things that I think that they should be doing other ways. And I will concede that it's not a perfect solution, but I think you're shooting yourself in the foot if you are only relying on vulnerability scan engines to discover what's in your network. However often you're running them, and the larger the organization, the more problematic it is to provide complete enterprise coverage,
Hmm.
and it's hard to look for things that they might be in address spaces that aren't on your list,
Yeah.
because not only has somebody spun up a VM for a system, but they've spun up a whole virtual network somewhere, or
Hmm.
multiple virtual VLANs. So if there's a lesson to be taken away from the first aspect of discovery, it's make sure you've got some way of doing discovery, albeit not perfect, but have some way of knowing what's in your network or what should be in your network before you start running the scan engines to actually look for the specific, are we impacted by this particular vulnerability type of thing.
Yeah. And, I think that's one of the technologies I hope we're going to be talking more about is that asset discovery. The
Mhm.
company that won the RSA Innovation Sandbox Award, or whatever that was, right, was about asset discovery. I think that's a problem
Right.
that we could still use some help with.
Yep.
Passively detecting it, as Tenable has the technology to do that, is also a great way. But, and like you said, virtual networks and then extend that out into cloud. Yes, there are additional pieces of functionality in vulnerability scanning and other products that reach into there, but you got to tie all that together, right? And even
Yep.
if you do, the enterprises I talk with are always like, yeah, we still feel like there's that like 1 to 3% that we're just never quite sure about, and that's what could bite us. So I still think that's a challenge today with discovery.
But I think that's actually healthy. If an organization says we think we know everything, but we aren't certain, there's always that
Yes.
it's like, I forget the mathematical term, but nothing ever gets to completely
Right.
100%.
Right.
There's always that sort of comfortable margin that you want to be within, and I think that is ultimately the goal.
Hmm.
And then hopefully you've got multiple ways of discovery, and it's okay at some point to run a scanner
Yeah. To
to
check
you know
yourself. Yeah.
to to check yourself, but don't think
Before
that
you wreck
that's the
yourself.
bottom line. Oh, I like that. That should be on a t-shirt.
Right.
But don't think ultimately that the scan engine is the last thing you do, and its results are gospel at that point. Because as good as they are, they don't always detect everything for any
Right.
number of
And
environmental reasons.
I think that's why temporary countermeasures kind of came to mind. I think it's just that
Hmm.
security defender in me going, like when I worked for university, going, I'll never really know 100% what's on the network. So I have to put some temporary countermeasures, right? Those are, I'm making sure that in all my new builds that, this patch is applied, that in my configuration management, I'm looking for it. But on my network, I'm putting in detection rules. I maybe have some firewall rules that can automatically detect a condition. Maybe there's I mean, the patches that were produced by a company called Zero Patch, right? That didn't require a
Hmm.
reboot. That could be another temporary countermeasure. Endpoint protection. There's lots of different. I call them temporary countermeasures, but I think they're just countermeasures in general that go beyond applying the patch. Is an important part of your strategy for this type of vulnerability, especially.
Well, yeah, that's really true. And again, I think of retail environments where, their production network, which we traditionally think is internal, is really at 1,000 different retail locations all
Yes.
across North America. And, just the uh, how difficult it is, even if they're have a plan and they're doing all the right things to get the patch to all the 1,000 different locations. And
Yep.
can it be something that's pushed out remotely, or do they have to have somebody locally do it? Um, yeah, so to me, temporary countermeasures might actually be more heavily leaning on increased detection capabilities, changing your thresholds of whatever your monitoring activities are if there's a footprint for the service that's impacted, like RDP,
Hmm.
be on the lookout for that. Or if there's the exploits that are known in the wild are typically exfiltrating over a traditional port, or at least there's a port associated with whatever service that is necessarily built into. You only got 65,000 and some odd options of how the data is being exfiltrated, if that's what we care about. Um, so be on the lookout for that type of thing.
Hmm.
I think that's the type of temporary countermeasure that I would rely on more heavily.
I My third item was being more resilient, and I mean I don't necessarily want to say like it's a page out of DevOps, but it's certainly a concept that I really like inside of DevOps,
Mhm.
or more so the newer style of manufacturing that emerged in the '70s, which is what the DevOps was based on. Right, was the goal, which
Mhm.
was based on manufacturing, specifically car uh, manufacturing, and applying that to your IT. And that's hard for some organizations. Like I just want to lead in with that there's a lot of legacy stuff out there, especially if your company's been in business for several years, right? You've got a lot of
Right.
legacy stuff to deal with that just is not resilient in the way that you can just keep pushing changes forward, right? And I
Right.
think what is attractive to me from a security perspective is that ability to continuously push forward, to be more resilient, to have ephemeral infrastructure, if you will, to be able to say, yeah, I've got a bunch of vulnerable Windows systems out there, but in the next push cycle, I'm going to push out new machines. I'm going to push out containers. Doesn't really apply to this, right? But
Mhm.
certainly in Azure, in the cloud, certainly virtual machines are still valid for this use case. But the ability to continually push, however that manifests itself, trying to break away from that legacy architecture where I set up a system, it's running this operating system, and
Mhm.
I have to go through a whole bunch of manual labor and testing to get it patched, to we're just continually pushing new software. For example, we use Automux, right? Continually pushing new patches with the ability to pull those back if we need to. So just keeping in mind that resiliency is really where it's at, and getting in the mindset, a DevOps mindset of continually pushing forward.
Yeah, two thoughts come to mind, and I largely agree with what you're saying. The first thought is, sort of the paradox in our world that technology is constantly advancing and moving forward, and of course, there's all sorts of new technologies that at least the vendors want all the
Mm.
enterprises out there to adopt. But the reason that there's legacy systems is A, because they work,
Mm-hmm.
and if it ain't broke, why fix it? Not in the vulnerability sense, but it's doing whatever it's doing,
Sure.
in terms of its job. And most organizations are reticent to, constantly go out and refresh. They would just, we've both worked for organizations that have the 30-year-old mainframe that's still chugging
Sure.
away, and they want to get the most use out of their investment, and that's something that just needs to be acknowledged in a greater way. And it ties into the resilient thing. What I see as the biggest problem for resilience, and again, it goes back to many of my customers, is they're so in tune to the 30-day patch cycle, and they've got processes in place
Mm-hmm.
for patch Tuesday comes, and Wednesday through whatever, we're going through, what's been released, and hopefully they're evaluating what applies to their environment, and they're not simply waiting for their next scan to find out whether they have a problem or not. But to me, the hardest problem that I see a lot of my customers have is just simply being able to execute the processes that they already have in place, because they're so attuned to doing it tied to Patch Tuesday, and to have the ability of doing it out of band, out of cycle, because something major just dropped on them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of companies really struggle with that, because
Right.
they're accustomed to, they've got all the muscle memory and the habit of doing it at a particular time. They don't necessarily know how to pull the trigger doing it, mid-month, if as it were.
Right. And I mean, I understand both sides of that. I've always been in the camp of you just got to continually push out patches and be resilient. Now, having, lived that life, I understand your hesitation to not to deploying patches more than every 30 days. Like, I get it.
Yep. Yep.
It is a nightmare. I just hope that we can adopt new technologies, whatever those are, to
Mhm.
get over that 30-day or whatever, and be able to change your environment, your infrastructure, your applications on a more frequent basis. I think that IT and security has to be able to do this in order to keep up. Otherwise, they're just going to ignore it entirely.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you lean more towards technology. I see it more of a process issue,
No, I go hand in
and
hand. Totally agree, Jeff. Yeah.
and just, again, just sort of, having the agility, as it were, to be able to execute what you've
Mm-hmm.
already got, in a way that's different from what you're accustomed to doing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and to me, that goes back to process, having the right people that are looking at the problem, that are identifying, hey, we need to do something now, not wait 3 weeks for the next, patch release. So, and depending on the organizations where they do have more different types of systems, unfortunately, most of the other systems, don't always patch even on a monthly basis. They're much more infrequent, and so they're even, the companies that I deal with are that much less inclined to be able to be nimble enough to do something on a moment's notice. Now, there are exceptions. I've certainly worked at companies that did have the ability to pull the trigger and react to a major
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability release, regardless of what the platform was, whether it was Microsoft or not. But that they were much more the exception to the rule than the
Yeah.
rule, from what I've seen.
Yeah, and I think my two things that I'd want if I were defending an enterprise stems from me filling in as the developer and my
Hmm.
goals for my own application. I really look at infrastructure as software today. I know we're not there yet, right? In by any stretch, there are organizations adopting that more and more, and that's awesome. But I still think many of the challenges we have in enterprises today, really stem from us moving towards infrastructure, security as code, infrastructure as
Hmm.
software. And when I
Hmm.
put it in my software context, right, these are two things that I'm striving for. And again, in my own application, I'm not there yet. I'm working towards the goal of constantly the application, or in this case, your environment, is being tested for certain conditions. I think the
Yep.
market of breach and attack simulation is awesome because it can do that in your infrastructure, right? And your mileages vary. There's open source, there's commercial tools, there's all kinds of options to do this. But having a repeatable process that runs through your environment and tells you about potential exposures, I think is really important. That would be one of the things that I would be looking certainly to implement. And then the second thing, so you do this in code through lots of various different things. Unit testing is one, automating your QA tests and your containerized environments, right? And then point two is configuration management, and
Hmm.
that's a different component in the application side, making sure all your configurations are the same, and the ability to push out new configurations. I mean, essentially, infrastructure configuration and code in DevOps containerized model is one, so it makes that a little easier. But now you put that back out on your infrastructure, you need some type of configuration management, right? That's going to tell you about conditions, but also let you change conditions in a uniform manner. Pushing out a new configuration change to 10,000 systems is certainly well within the scope. It takes a lot of work to get there. There's some great vendors. I think the recent tech segment from SaltStack really kind of put that in the forefront of my brain, that We really do need this in IT today. So the ability to constantly check for conditions, both in exposures and configuration, and then fix them, I think is where it's at, especially when you're defending against these highly and likely exploitable vulnerabilities that come out from Microsoft.
Yeah, I guess my thought here is, and part of this is the common excuse, and I'm sure you've heard it, that, but if we do this change, it's going to break our primary application. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's been an excuse for not patching since the very beginning.
Mm.
Um, uh, uh, but and I think I have a certain amount of skepticism when I hear that as an excuse. But recent customers, it really is impactful in terms of um, not necessarily the functionality of their primary application, but in terms of performance or load.
Sure.
Uh, you know, how do you fit in? It's great to be able to set up an environment, do the testing quickly so that you can prepare the patch and whatever changes need to be made. But what happens when there is that major impact where you're more or less having to go back to the whiteboard in terms of a fix? And I guess in addition to that, the excuse is very often not from the application group themselves, but from if they're using a third-party app,
Yep.
having to involve the vendor that sold them the primary application in the first place and get them on board with, guys, we need to make this change, and we tested it, and it's breaking your application. Vendors are notorious for not being as resilient or as
Mm-hmm.
responsive as the customer needs
It's true.
in order for the customer to meet their demands of putting out the more secure system to fix.
Yeah, it's difficult today, I think, with infrastructure to do this, right? In your application, for example, right? At my application's Python, I'm looking to move to Python 3 versus Python 2. I want to be able to just automate all my tests. I want to basically simulate that change. What does it mean?
Right.
And fix the
Right.
things that are broken, and then move forward. Now that's great when it's one application and a couple of containers, right? Like everything's
Right.
golden. When you've got 70,000 desktops, physical computers, it's really hard to simulate the impact of a patch or a configuration change. Even if you've got a lab, you've got test images, you've got someone behind the keyboard, essentially, like in your example of PCI with retail, right? There's people physically on the keyboard making changes, and those are just things that it's next to impossible to model what the impact of a change is. And I think that's one reason why it's really hard to do that in enterprises today, and it's challenging.
Yep. So we agree it's challenging, and we don't have a good answer for it.
Right? I mean, if this stuff were easy,
Right.
anyone
Yep.
would do it, right? And everyone would be doing it. But, there's challenges. So those are some tips to defend your environment against major Microsoft vulnerabilities. With that, we can take a short break, come back, talk about the enterprise news for the week.